Robert adjusted his tailored blazer, glancing at his watch with a subtle air of impatience. His life was measured in seconds, each one too valuable to be wasted. Seated in the plush comfort of first class, the Phoenix skyline glimmering through the plane's window, he was already mentally preparing for the high-stakes meeting awaiting him in New York. But something, a scent, broke his concentration. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was intrusive, sharp, earthy, and out of place in the sterile world of luxury travel. Robert's brow furrowed as he turned, scanning the rows behind him. That's when he spotted him. An elderly man hunched over, his wiry frame barely filling the seat in economy class. His clothes were plain, wrinkled, and faintly stained, with a small, battered duffel bag at his feet. The man, Daniel, didn't seem aware of the stares. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the strap of his bag, his weathered face lined with the kind of wear that comes not just from age, but from a life of relentless struggle. "That smell," Robert said sharply, summoning a flight attendant with a curt wave. "It's coming from him." The attendant hesitated, her expression torn between professionalism and unease. Robert didn't wait for her response. "Is it too much to ask for some basic decency? This is a shared space, not a barnyard," he continued, his voice loud enough for several passengers to overhear. Daniel looked up, startled by the sudden attention. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice rough but soft. I take care of stray animals. I had to feed them before coming here. I didn't have time to." His words trailed off, swallowed by the weight of humiliation. "That's no excuse," Robert interrupted, his tone icy. "If you can't travel like a civilized person, you shouldn't travel at all." The cabin buzzed with murmurs. Some passengers whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from discomfort to sympathy. Others avoided looking at Daniel altogether, as if his presence alone was a contagion. The attendant leaned down, speaking to Daniel in hushed tones. A few moments later, he nodded, slowly rising from his seat. The old man's movements were deliberate, each one imbued with a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to the spectacle unfolding. As Daniel shuffled toward the exit, his head slightly bowed, he turned briefly to glance at the cabin. His eyes met Robert's for a fleeting moment, an unspoken question lingering there, one that Robert refused to acknowledge. The plane door closed behind Daniel, and with it, the chapter of an encounter that seemed, at first glance, insignificant. Yet what Robert couldn't know, what no one in that cabin could have guessed, was that this single act would set off a chain of events that would shake him to his very core. Robert Parker was the kind of man people envied and feared in equal measure. At 42, he had built a business empire from the ground up, turning a modest tech startup into a billion-dollar juggernaut. His name graced magazine covers, his penthouse views were the envy of Phoenix's elite, and his taste for the finer things in life was well documented. But behind the sleek suits and carefully curated image was a man shaped by an unrelenting hunger for control. Born to a working-class family in a dusty Arizona town, Robert had clawed his way out of poverty, often at the expense of others. To him, empathy was a liability, a weakness that could derail success. His rigid mindset had served him well in business, but left little room for connection or compassion. Yet, beneath the layers of arrogance and ambition, there was a flicker of something unresolved, something buried so deep that even Robert himself barely acknowledged it. It was a pain that reared its head in unexpected moments, only to be pushed back down by the comforting distraction of wealth and power. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper's life was a stark contrast. At 73, his days were defined not by boardrooms or billion-dollar deals, but by selfless service. A retired construction worker, Daniel had spent the past decade dedicating his time and meager savings to rescuing stray animals in his Phoenix neighborhood. His modest home doubled as a sanctuary for abandoned dogs, many of which were old, sick, or otherwise unwanted. For Daniel, The work was both a calling and a coping mechanism. After losing his wife, Martha, to cancer 5 years ago, the animals became his family. They filled the silence of his empty house, their wagging tails and soulful eyes offering a balm for his grief. But the work was not without sacrifice. His pension barely covered the cost of food and medical care for the animals, and he often went without new clothes or even proper meals to ensure they were cared for. Daniel's trip that day was meant to be a rare moment of reprieve. A local animal rescue organization had invited him to speak at a conference in New York, covering his airfare and accommodations. It was a chance to share his story and perhaps inspire others to take up the cause. But as he sat on that plane, surrounded by people who looked at him with disdain, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Robert and Daniel were two men at opposite ends of life's spectrum, one consumed by material success, the other by quiet sacrifice. Yet, they shared something neither of them recognized, a deep-seated pain that shaped their choices. Robert's disdain for Daniel wasn't just about the smell. It was a visceral reaction to something he couldn't articulate, a reminder of the life he had fought so hard to escape. Daniel's presence, with his threadbare clothes and air of humility, was a stark contrast to the polished, untouchable world Robert had built for himself. For Daniel, Robert's cruelty wasn't new. He had encountered plenty of people who dismissed him because of his appearance or the work he did. But there was something in Robert's eyes that struck him, not just anger, but a flicker of loneliness. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it stayed with him as he walked off the plane, his heart heavy with more than just the weight of his duffel bag. Two lives, seemingly worlds apart, had collided in a moment of tension. Neither man could have predicted the profound impact they would have on each other. And as the hours passed, the memory of that encounter began to settle in their minds, like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples they couldn't yet see. The tension on the plane was palpable, a crackling undercurrent that rippled through the cabin as Daniel was escorted away. Most passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of whether to intervene or remain silent. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others busied themselves with their phones, pretending not to notice. For Robert, the incident was already a distant annoyance. He had achieved what he wanted. The unpleasant smell was gone, and he could now focus on the emails piling up in his inbox. He didn't spare a second thought for the man he had humiliated. After all, the world was built on hierarchy, wasn't it? Those who couldn't meet the standards didn't belong. But for Daniel, the weight of the moment settled heavily on his chest as he sat in the cold, impersonal waiting area of the terminal. His wrinkled hands clutched the strap of his duffel bag tightly, his knuckles white from the effort. He replayed the scene in his mind. The accusatory tone, the disdain in Robert's eyes, and the murmurs of agreement from some of the other passengers. He had been here before, not in a plane, but in countless other spaces where he felt he didn't belong. Spaces where his work, his sacrifices, and even his existence were dismissed as insignificant. But the sting of it never dulled, no matter how many times it happened. Daniel wasn't a confrontational man. He wasn't one to raise his voice or demand fairness. Instead, he had learned to carry his burdens quietly, finding solace in the lives he had saved and the wagging tails that greeted him each morning. But sitting there, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal, he felt a rare flicker of anger, not just at Robert, but at the world that seemed to celebrate men like him while erasing men like Daniel. Back on the plane, the flight attendant approached Robert hesitantly. "Sir, I just wanted to inform you that the passenger has been rebooked on another flight. He'll be departing later today." Robert barely looked up. "Good. I trust this won't happen again," he said dismissively, his eyes fixed on his laptop screen. The attendant nodded, but there was something in her gaze, a quiet judgment that lingered as she walked away. Robert noticed it, but he quickly brushed it off. He wasn't one to care about the opinions of others, especially not those who worked for him or, in this case, served him. As the flight took off, Robert leaned back in his seat, scrolling through his emails. Yet, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, his thoughts kept drifting back to the old man. The smell of animals, the tremor in his voice, the lines on his face that spoke of a life far harder than Robert had ever known. It wasn't pity he felt. He would never admit to that. But there was something unsettling about the encounter, a gnawing discomfort that refused to fade. Hours later, as the plane touched down in New York, Robert quickly forgot about the incident, swept up in the flurry of his schedule. Meetings, calls, and presentations filled his day, leaving little room for reflection. Meanwhile, Daniel boarded his rescheduled flight with a heavy heart. He hadn't told anyone about what had happened. Not the airline staff, not the animal rescue team waiting for him in New York. It wasn't that he was ashamed. It was more that he didn't see the point. What could anyone do about the way the world worked? As the plane soared into the clouds, Daniel stared out of the window, his thoughts far from the city below. He didn't know that his quiet departure from that first flight would set into motion events that neither he nor Robert could have foreseen. Robert's day began like any other. A 5 a.m. alarm, followed by an intense workout in the private gym of his New York penthouse. The sprawling glass windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but Robert barely glanced at them as he powered through sets of squats and deadlifts. His mind was already occupied with the day ahead. A string of meetings with high-profile investors, a media interview, and an exclusive dinner with potential collaborators. Yet, something felt off. As he stood in the shower, letting the steaming water cascade over his skin, his thoughts drifted back to the previous day. He hadn't thought about the old man since leaving the plane, but now the image of Daniel's face surfaced unexpectedly. Robert tried to push it away, shifting his focus to the multi-million-dollar deal he was about to close. But the moment lingered. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. Robert didn't believe in guilt. It was a useless emotion, a roadblock to progress. But there was an itch, an irritation he couldn't quite name. The man's face had carried something. Resignation, maybe? Or perhaps it was a quiet dignity in the way Daniel had walked off the plane, clutching his bag like it held everything he had left in the world. "Forget it," Robert muttered to himself, shaking his head as if to clear the thought. By the time he was seated in the back of his black SUV, he had compartmentalized the memory, locking it away with all the other things he chose not to think about. The morning passed in a blur of boardrooms and presentations, the hum of business drowning out the noise in his mind. Investors nodded in approval, their questions sharp but predictable. Robert was in his element, commanding the room with his usual confidence. But during a break, as he scrolled through his phone while waiting for his next meeting, a headline caught his eye. Local hero and animal rescuer misses flight after incident with millionaire passenger. His heart skipped a beat. The accompanying photo was unmistakable. It was Daniel, standing outside the terminal with his duffel bag, his face lined with exhaustion. Robert's first reaction was irritation. Who had leaked the story? Surely it was one of the passengers on the flight. The article didn't name him explicitly, but the implication was clear. The comments section was a sea of outrage. How heartless can people be? This man dedicates his life to helping animals, and he's treated like garbage. Disgusting. Whoever caused this should be ashamed. Robert closed the article and set his phone down, a wave of unease washing over him. He didn't care about the opinions of strangers. He'd been criticized before, and it had never fazed him. But this felt different. The rest of the day was a struggle. During his media interview, he found himself distracted, fumbling through answers he would normally deliver with ease. At dinner, the conversations felt hollow, the laughter forced. Even the filet mignon, perfectly cooked, tasted like nothing. That night, alone in his penthouse, Robert poured himself a glass of scotch and stood by the window, staring out at the glittering city below. The story of the old man wouldn't leave him. Why did it bother him so much? He had encountered countless people like Daniel before. People who had failed to rise above their circumstances, weighed down by bad luck or poor choices. But there was something about Daniel that stuck with him. Maybe it was the man's quiet defiance, the way he had looked at Robert with eyes that seemed to see through the layers of wealth and status. Or maybe it was the fact that, deep down, Robert saw a part of himself in Daniel, a younger version of himself, before the money, before the walls he'd built around his heart. The next morning, Robert woke early, but instead of heading to his gym, he found himself sitting at his dining table, staring at his laptop. He typed Daniel's name into the search bar, and a flood of results appeared. Articles about his work with stray animals, photos of him surrounded by dogs, and testimonials from people whose lives he had touched. One story, in particular, caught Robert's attention. It was about a sick, elderly dog that Daniel had found on the side of the road. The dog had been given just weeks to live, but under Daniel's care, it had survived for over a year, spending its final days in peace and comfort. The article quoted Daniel as saying, "Every life matters, no matter how small or broken. If we don't care for each other, what's the point of it all?" Robert leaned back in his chair, the words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. It wasn't guilt or shame, but a quiet question. Had he been wrong? And if so, what could he do about it? The unease that had haunted him since the flight deepened, but it brought with it a strange, almost electric sense of possibility. Robert wasn't used to feeling unsure. Every decision in his life had been calculated, precise, and aimed at one goal: success. Yet now, as he sat in the back of his SUV, cruising through the streets of Phoenix, a strange, nervous energy coursed through him. He wasn't sure why he was here or what he expected to achieve. The only thing he knew was that the thought of Daniel Harper had followed him like a shadow for days, gnawing at the edges of his mind. After hours of research and a few discreet calls to contacts in the city, Robert had found an address. It wasn't much to go on, just a modest house on the outskirts of Phoenix, where Daniel apparently ran his small animal rescue. When the car stopped, Robert hesitated. He glanced out the window at the unassuming home in front of him. The paint was chipped, the lawn overgrown in places, and the faint sound of barking carried on the dry Arizona breeze. It was a far cry from the polished mansions and skyscrapers he was used to. "Sir, do you need me to wait?" his driver asked, breaking the silence. Robert shook his head. "No, I'll call when I'm done." As he stepped out of the car, he straightened his blazer instinctively, only to realize how out of place it looked in this setting. The gravel crunched beneath his polished leather shoes as he approached the house. Before he could knock, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a pair of curious, dark eyes. It wasn't Daniel, but a dog, an old, scruffy mutt with patches of gray fur and a limp. The dog regarded him cautiously, its tail wagging just enough to suggest it wasn't entirely sure whether Robert was friend or foe. "Can I help you?" The voice startled Robert, and he looked up to see Daniel standing in the doorway. The man was smaller than Robert remembered, his frame stooped but sturdy. His clothes were the same kind of plain, well-worn garments he had worn on the plane, and his expression was a mix of surprise and suspicion. For a moment, Robert couldn't speak. Seeing Daniel here, in his element, surrounded by the dogs he cared for, felt oddly humbling. "I'm Robert Parker," he finally said, extending a hand. We met on the plane last week." Daniel didn't shake his hand. Instead, he studied Robert with a quiet intensity, his weathered face unreadable. "I remember," he said simply. Robert lowered his hand, feeling an unexpected sting of rejection. "I wanted to apologize," he said. the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "The way I treated you, it was wrong." Daniel's brow furrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured for Robert to enter. Inside, the house was modest but warm, filled with the distinct smells of animals. Wet fur, dry kibble, and a faint hint of antiseptic. Several dogs lay sprawled on the floor or curled up on worn-out cushions, their eyes following Robert as he stepped cautiously into the living room. "Why are you really here?" Daniel asked, his tone not unkind but firm. Robert hesitated. He had rehearsed this moment in his head, but now that he was here, the polished explanations he'd crafted felt hollow. "I've been thinking about what happened. About you," he admitted. "I read about what you do, taking care of these animals, dedicating your life to something bigger than yourself. And I don't know. It made me question some things about myself." Daniel's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "Most people don't care about what I do until it affects them personally," he said. "What changed for you?" Robert let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I guess I've spent so much of my life focused on building my business, my image, my success. But when I saw you walk off that plane," he paused, struggling to find the right words, "it made me realize how small all of that feels compared to what you're doing. You're actually making a difference." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Robert as if trying to see past the polished exterior to the man underneath. Finally, he gestured to a chair. "Have a seat," he said. Over the next hour, Robert listened as Daniel shared his story, his work, his sacrifices, and the deep losses that had shaped his life. For the first time in years, Robert found himself not talking, not strategizing, but simply listening. By the time Robert left, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. As he walked back to his car, the scruffy dog from earlier limped after him, its tail wagging more confidently now. Robert crouched down, his expensive suit brushing the gravel, and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You've got a good place here," he murmured, glancing back at the house. The dog licked his hand, and for the first time in years, Robert felt something he couldn't quite name, a quiet sense of peace. Robert wasn't sure what he expected to happen after his visit to Daniel's rescue center. Maybe he had hoped for some form of closure, a chance to apologize and move on. But as the days passed, he found himself haunted by the experience. He couldn't shake the image of the cramped living room, the dogs with their hopeful eyes, or the quiet dignity in Daniel's voice as he spoke about his work. The visit had stirred something in Robert, something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of inadequacy. For all his wealth, power, and accomplishments, he had never known the kind of purpose that seemed to drive Daniel. It was a jarring realization for a man who had spent his life believing success was measured by numbers on a balance sheet and the size of his penthouse. Back at his office in New York, Robert's assistant, Caroline, noticed a shift almost immediately. He was quieter than usual, his sharp focus dulled by distraction. "Mr. Parker," she said one afternoon, placing a stack of reports on his desk. "You seem off lately. Is everything okay?" Robert looked up from his laptop, startled by her observation. He considered brushing it off, but instead, he leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh. "Do you think money makes people happy, Caroline?" She blinked, caught off guard. "I think it helps," she said carefully. "But it's not everything." Robert nodded absently, her words striking a chord. "Yeah," he muttered. "It's not." Later that evening, Robert sat alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of scotch as he stared out at the glittering skyline. The city had always felt like his domain, a concrete jungle he had conquered through sheer will and determination. But tonight it felt cold, almost alien. His thoughts drifted back to Daniel. The man had so little, Yet he seemed richer in ways Robert couldn't fathom. For years, Robert had prided himself on his independence, his ability to succeed without relying on anyone else. But now he wondered if he had misunderstood what true wealth really meant. The next morning, Robert made a decision. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. "Mr. Parker," the attorney answered briskly. "What can I do for you?" "I want to set up a foundation," Robert said, his voice firm. "Something that supports animal rescues, shelters, and rehabilitation programs. And I wanted to start with Daniel Harper's Center in Phoenix." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's unexpected," the attorney said. "But of course, I can draft the necessary paperwork. How much are we allocating?" Robert hesitated for a moment, then said, "Let's start with $10 million. The attorney coughed in surprise. "That's a significant amount, Mr. Parker. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Robert replied. Over the next few weeks, Robert threw himself into the project with a vigor he hadn't felt in years. He worked closely with his team to design the foundation, ensuring it would be more than just a tax write-off. He wanted it to make a real difference, to honor the work that people like Daniel were doing. When the foundation was officially launched, Robert made sure Daniel was the first to know. He flew back to Phoenix unannounced, pulling up to the rescue center in the same black SUV. Daniel greeted him with a mix of surprise and skepticism. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said, crossing his arms. Robert smiled faintly. "I figured I owed you more than just an apology." He handed Daniel a folder containing the details of the foundation, along with a check for $1 million to expand the rescue center. Daniel's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "I don't understand," Daniel said, looking up at Robert. "Why are you doing this?" Robert's smile faded, replaced by an expression of quiet sincerity. "Because I've spent my whole life chasing the wrong kind of success," he said. "And you showed me that there's more to life than money and power. You showed me what it means to care about something bigger than yourself." For a long moment, Daniel didn't say anything. Then, to Robert's surprise, the older man extended his hand. This time, Robert took it without hesitation. As they shook hands, a scruffy dog wandered up and pressed its nose against Robert's leg. It was the same dog from his last visit, and its tail wagged furiously as Robert crouched down to scratch behind its ears. "Looks like you've made a friend," Daniel said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Robert chuckled. "Maybe I'll take him home," he said, half joking. But as the dog licked his hand, Robert realized he wasn't joking at all. The announcement of the Parker-Harper Foundation rippled through the local community like a stone dropped into still water. At first, it was met with skepticism. People knew Robert Parker as the hard-nosed billionaire whose name was synonymous with ruthless business deals and luxury skyscrapers, not philanthropy. But as the details emerged, his sizable initial donation, the ongoing support structure for shelters, and his direct involvement, opinions began to shift. For Daniel, the transformation was surreal. He had spent decades scraping by, relying on donations from kind strangers and his own limited resources to keep his rescue center afloat. Now, with the foundation's funding, he could afford the things he had only dreamed of: better facilities, a small team of staff, and even a proper veterinary clinic on site. But the changes didn't stop there. As news of the foundation spread, so did its influence. Other animal rescue centers across Arizona reached out, seeking advice and partnerships. The foundation began connecting shelters, creating a network that allowed them to share resources, knowledge, and support. For the first time, many of these organizations felt seen and valued. One of the most touching moments came a month after the foundation's launch, when a local news station aired a segment about the rescue center. The story featured Daniel and Robert standing side by side, surrounded by happy, wagging tails. The footage showed Daniel speaking with quiet humility about his work, and Robert visibly moved as he described his journey to understanding the value of compassion. The segment ended with an unexpected twist. A family came forward, claiming they had been looking for the scruffy dog Robert had bonded with during his visits. The dog, named Max, had been their family pet for years before getting lost during a cross-country move. They had given up hope of finding him, but recognized him instantly on the news. When they arrived at the center to reunite with Max, Robert was there. He watched as the dog bounded toward the family, his tail wagging furiously as a little girl hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. It was a bittersweet moment for Robert, who had grown attached to Max. But as he watched the reunion, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pure joy. "You've done a good thing here," Daniel said quietly, standing beside him. Robert nodded, his eyes fixed on the family. "It's not just me. This is your work, Daniel. I'm just helping it grow." The foundation's success began to inspire change in Robert's personal life as well. The cold, transactional relationships he had once valued no longer satisfied him. He started reconnecting with people he had pushed away over the years. Old friends, distant family members, even former colleagues he had fallen out with. One of the most significant changes was his relationship with his assistant, Caroline. She had worked for him for years, quietly enduring his sharp words and relentless demands. Now, he found himself asking for her input, thanking her for her work, and even giving her time off, something he had rarely done before. "Who are you, and what have you done with Mr. Parker?" she teased one day after he approved a generous Christmas bonus for the entire staff. Robert laughed, a sound that felt foreign to him, but also oddly freeing. "Maybe I'm just trying to be a better version of myself," he replied. The foundation's impact wasn't limited to animal welfare. It began to touch lives in unexpected ways. Volunteers at the rescue center reported feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Local businesses started donating supplies and services. Schools organized field trips to the center, teaching children about empathy and responsibility. For Robert, the ripple effect was both humbling and empowering. He had spent his life chasing success, believing that power and wealth were the ultimate goals. But now, as he stood on the sidelines watching the foundation grow, he realized he had been wrong. Success wasn't about what you achieved for yourself. It was about the impact you had on others. One evening, as Robert prepared to leave the center after a long day, Daniel stopped him. "I don't know what made you change your mind about all this," Daniel said, his voice quiet but steady. "But I'm glad you did." Robert smiled, looking around at the bustling activity. The staff tending to the animals, the volunteers chatting and laughing, the dogs playing in the yard. "Me too," he said, as he drove away, the Phoenix sunset casting a golden glow over the desert landscape. Robert felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The journey that had begun with a moment of thoughtless cruelty on a plane had led him to a place of unexpected redemption. And for the first time, he was excited to see where the path would take him next. Months after the Parker-Harper Foundation was established, Robert stood at the grand opening ceremony for the expanded rescue center. The once humble facility now boasted state-of-the-art kennels, a spacious outdoor play area, and a fully equipped veterinary clinic. The event had drawn a sizable crowd: local families, volunteers, city officials, and even reporters, all eager to witness the transformation. Robert scanned the crowd, spotting Daniel near the stage. The older man looked the same as ever, dressed in his plain flannel shirt and jeans, a slight stoop to his shoulders. But there was a new lightness to him, a quiet pride that Robert hadn't seen before. As the mayor wrapped up her speech, she turned to Robert and handed him the microphone. The crowd erupted into applause, and Robert felt a wave of nerves he hadn't expected. Public speaking wasn't new to him. But this wasn't a shareholders meeting or a corporate presentation. This was personal. He stepped up to the podium, taking a moment to let the applause die down. His eyes swept the crowd, landing on Daniel, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Thank you all for being here," Robert began, his voice steady but warm. "I've stood on a lot of stages in my life, but this one feels different. Special. Not because of me, but because of what it represents." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "A few months ago, I met a man who challenged everything I thought I knew about success. That man is Daniel Harper." The crowd turned to Daniel, who shifted uncomfortably under the attention. Robert smiled at him before continuing. "Daniel showed me that true wealth isn't about money or power. It's about the impact you have on the world around you. It's about caring for something bigger than yourself, even when no one else seems to notice. He spent his life doing that, and today I'm honored to stand here and help amplify his work." The applause was louder this time, and Robert took a step back, letting Daniel take his place at the podium. "I'm not much for speeches," Daniel said, his voice rough but steady. "But I'll say this, none of this would have been possible without all of you. And as much as I'd like to take credit, the truth is, we're just getting started. There are still so many animals out there who need our help. And thanks to this foundation, we can reach them." After the ceremony, Robert mingled with the crowd. Families approached him to thank him for his generosity, and volunteers shared stories of how the center had changed their lives. But the moment that stood out the most came from an unexpected source. A young man, no older than 18, approached Robert hesitantly. He wore a worn hoodie and had the nervous energy of someone used to being overlooked. "Mr. Parker," the young man said. Robert turned to him, his expression kind. "That's me. How can I help you?" The young man shifted awkwardly, then held out a small envelope. I wanted to say thank you. I used to come here when I was a kid. Back then, my family didn't have much, and this place was the only thing that felt safe. Seeing what you've done here, it means a lot." Robert took the envelope, his chest tightening as he read the note inside. It was a simple thank you letter, but the heartfelt words struck a chord. "Thank you," Robert said, his voice thick. "It means a lot to me that you'd share this." The young man nodded and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Robert holding the letter. Later that evening, as the event wound down and the sun dipped below the horizon, Robert and Daniel found themselves standing side by side near the edge of the property. "You know," Robert said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I used to think I had it all figured out. But this feels like the first time I'm doing something that actually matters." Daniel chuckled softly. "Took you long enough." Robert laughed, shaking his head. "Guess I'm a slow learner." The two men stood there for a while longer, watching as the dogs played in the yard, their joyful barks filling the air. As Robert prepared to leave, Daniel turned to him. "So, what's next for you?" Robert smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't know yet, but I think I'm finally okay with not having all the answers." He reached down to pat a familiar scruffy dog on the head, Max, who had decided to stay at the center to help Daniel. "Take care of him," Robert said with a wink. Daniel nodded. "Don't worry. He's in good hands." As Robert walked to his car, he felt a sense of fulfillment that no business deal or financial milestone had ever given him. He had started this journey as a man who thought he had everything, only to realize how much he had been missing. And now, for the first time in his life, he was ready to embrace the unknown, knowing that the best things often came when you least expected them.